Self-respect is the invisible foundation upon which everything else in life is built. It is not always loud, it does not always need to be declared, but it shapes how a person walks, how they speak, and how they carry themselves through the storms and the calm. Without self-respect, even the greatest victories feel hollow because they are won through compromise of the very essence that makes one whole. With self-respect, even small steps become mountains because they are walked in alignment with inner truth. To understand the power of self-respect, one must first realize that it is not given by the world. Recognition complements status or possessions. These are fleeting. They rise and fall with time, with people's changing opinions, with the unpredictability of circumstance. If self-respect is tied to such unstable sources, it is fragile. True self-respect grows from within, from the unwavering acknowledgement of one's own value, from knowing that existence itself is enough to justify dignity. When a person respects themselves, they stop begging for validation. They stop adjusting their entire being to fit the molds of others. There is a quiet refusal to shrink. They may still bend with life's winds, but they do not break to please. This is where strength begins, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in the calm recognition that one does not need to trade their essence for acceptance. Self-respect is also discipline. It is not indulgence in every desire or surrender to every impulse. It is the restraint to say no to what diminishes, no matter how tempting it may seem in the moment. The mind can trick itself into believing that compromise will bring peace, that giving up a piece of one's dignity will secure comfort. But such comfort is always short-lived. Self-respect is the voice that says, "This action is beneath me not because I am greater than others, but because I must remain whole within myself." There is power in how self-respect affects energy. When one carries themselves with respect, they attract respect. The posture, the tone, the choices, all radiate a signal that tells the world how to engage. Those who lack respect for themselves are often treated as such, not because the world is just, but because energy mirrors energy. A person who walks with self-respect does not need to demand it from others. It is felt in their presence. Self-respect also influences relationships. Without it, connections become unbalanced, dependent, even suffocating. One seeks from others what should come from within, and when it is not given, resentment grows. But when self-respect is strong, relationships become freer, more authentic, because they are not rooted in neediness, but in mutual recognition. One does not cling, one does not beg, one does not sacrifice dignity in exchange for affection. Instead, one gives and receives from a place of balance. The power of self-respect extends to choices in daily life. It shapes how one spends time, where one directs attention, and what one tolerates. The person with self-respect does not waste energy on what corrupts their spirit. They choose environments that nourish rather than drain, conversations that uplift rather than diminish, habits that strengthen rather than weaken. Every small decision becomes an act of self-honoring, and these acts accumulate into a life lived with integrity. It is important to note that self-respect is not pride. Pride often seeks to compare, to stand taller by looking down on others. Self-respect is rooted in humility, for it acknowledges that all beings are worthy, and thus oneself too must be treated as worthy. It does not place one above, nor does it place one below. It is balance, the steady ground upon which true growth can take place. Self-respect is also tested in silence when no one is watching. It is easy to maintain dignity when the world is looking, but it is in private moments where integrity is revealed. The discipline to act with respect when unseen creates an inner strength that cannot be shaken by external forces. In such solitude, a person either betrays themselves or fortifies themselves. Choosing respect in those quiet moments builds unshakable character. The power of self-respect is deeply connected to freedom. When one respects themselves, they are free from the chains of comparison, from the endless chase for approval, from the desperation to be accepted. They no longer adjust their truth for fear of rejection. This freedom allows them to live fully, to create, to speak, to act without the weight of pretense. Respecting oneself means living authentically, without apology for existing as one is. The absence of self-respect, however, breeds suffering. It leads to patterns of compromise that erode the soul, to cycles of dependence that never end, to silent anger that eats away from within. One may try to cover this emptiness with distractions, achievements, or relationships, but none will fill the void. Only by turning inward and recognizing one's own worth does the healing begin. To cultivate self-respect requires awareness. It requires observation of how one speaks to oneself, how one allows others to treat them, how one chooses to spend their time. Every thought and action can either reinforce dignity or diminish it. By becoming conscious of these patterns, one begins to reclaim power. Each decision becomes a chance to affirm worth, to choose alignment with what uplifts rather than what depletes. Self-respect transforms how one faces challenges. Instead of viewing difficulties as punishment, one sees them as opportunities to grow stronger, to uphold dignity even in adversity. Pain is no longer a reason to break, but a chance to deepen resilience. The trials of life cannot strip away what has been firmly rooted within. The power of self-respect is not loud, yet it is undeniable. It is not something that can be borrowed, gifted, or stolen. It is cultivated through choices, through awareness, through the steady commitment to remain whole in a world that constantly demands fragments. It is both shield and sword, both anchor and flame, guiding one to live with authenticity, balance, and quiet strength in a world where abundance is celebrated, where more is always believed to be better. It is easy to overlook the profound truth that scarcity creates value. This truth is visible all around us, woven into the fabric of life, nature, and human experience. When something is rare, when something cannot be found everywhere and at any moment, it becomes precious. Its worth does not lie only in its form, but in its limited availability. The scarcity itself shapes the way we look at it, the way we desire it, and the way we protect it. Without scarcity, there is no true recognition of value, because what is always present often goes unseen, unappreciated, and taken for granted. Think about time. Each of us is granted only a certain number of years, days, and hours. If life stretched endlessly, if time had no end, urgency would vanish, meaning would dissolve, and the motivation to create, to love, to pursue purpose would fade away. It is precisely because time is scarce that it is valuable. The limitation of time gives weight to every moment, depth to every relationship, and significance to every decision. People who awaken to this reality begin to treat their hours differently, understanding that every second that slips away will never return. In this scarcity lies the power to live fully. The same applies to resources. In ancient societies, water in the desert was sacred. A single drop could determine survival or death. The scarcity of water made it more valuable than gold. Even today, in certain parts of the world, people know the worth of clean water, not because they read about it, but because they experience its absence. When you realize that something you depend on is limited, the relationship you have with it changes completely. You do not waste it. You honor it. You protect it. Scarcity awakens responsibility. Scarcity also creates value in human connections. Imagine being constantly surrounded by countless voices, faces, and interactions. In such abundance, depth can be lost. But when someone chooses to give you their undivided attention, when someone chooses to truly listen, that act becomes rare. In a world full of noise, silence is scarce and therefore powerful. In a world full of superficial exchanges, authentic presence is scarce and therefore invaluable. The rarity of true attention gives it the power to heal, to inspire, to transform. Even suffering teaches this lesson. When joy was constant, uninterrupted, and overflowing, it would lose its meaning. But joy after hardship, light after darkness, peace after chaos, these moments shine brighter because they are not endless. Their value is carved out by contrast, by the scarcity of their appearance in the rhythm of life. Scarcity does not always mean absence. It also means uniqueness. It means the fleeting nature of experiences that cannot be repeated in exactly the same way. Consider the world of art. A painting, a sculpture, or a handwritten manuscript is valued not simply because of what it depicts, but because there is only one original. Reproductions can be made, but the original holds a power the copies never will. Its scarcity makes it priceless. If everything were infinitely reproducible, originality would dissolve into irrelevance. Scarcity protects uniqueness, and uniqueness creates value. Scarcity also plays a role in discipline and mastery. If energy were unlimited, if motivation never fluctuated, then effort would lose its meaning. But because energy must be managed carefully, because focus is limited, one must learn to prioritize. What you choose to give your scarce energy to is what determines the quality of your life. If you scatter it on distractions, it evaporates. If you concentrate it on growth, it transforms you. The scarcity of energy forces you to choose, and that choice creates value. The scarcity of opportunities also gives life its direction. When a door opens only once, the weight of the decision is greater. You cannot assume it will appear again. This is why certain moments define entire lifetimes. It is not because they were abundant, but because they were rare, perhaps even singular. Scarcity sharpens awareness. It calls you to act with courage, to embrace the chance before it disappears. Without scarcity, hesitation would reign. With scarcity, urgency awakens. Scarcity is not always external. It lives within the mind as well. Clarity is scarce in a world of constant noise and information. Because of this, when clarity appears, when stillness settles in the mind like a calm lake, it carries immense value. One clear thought has more power than 1,000 scattered ones. One moment of true insight can transform the trajectory of a life. Scarcity creates value even in the inner landscape, reminding us that what is rare within must be nurtured, not wasted. Nature embodies this principle endlessly. The blooming of certain flowers happens only once a year. Migratory birds appear only for a season. The night sky reveals certain alignments only once in centuries. These natural scarcities remind us to look up, to pause, to recognize the sacredness of fleeting beauty. If every flower bloomed forever, their fragrance would lose its charm. If the night sky were always lit with extraordinary sights, the ordinary stars would go unnoticed. Scarcity teaches us to revere the temporary, to honor what cannot last. The paradox is that while scarcity creates value, humans often resist it. We long for endlessness, for permanence, for abundance without end. Yet the very longing blinds us to the gift within limitation. Scarcity creates appreciation. It teaches discernment. It sharpens vision. It forces us to decide what matters most. It filters out the meaningless so the meaningful can be seen. Scarcity is not merely about lack, it is about presence. Because what is scarce demands our full awareness, our respect, our gratitude. Scarcity creates value because it awakens recognition. Without scarcity, there is no urgency, no uniqueness, no sacredness. It is scarcity that transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary, the fleeting into the unforgettable, and the limited into the precious. There is a certain power that arises when one begins to understand the boundary of emotional control. For most people, emotions appear as spontaneous visitors, sudden currents that sweep through the body and the mind. Anger arrives uninvited, sadness lingers without notice. Joy passes like a fleeting guest. Many live as though these emotions are in full command, dictating actions, choices, and even one's entire destiny. Yet within discipline, within self-awareness, a person begins to realize that emotions are not masters, they are signals. They are movements of energy within, and it is not their presence that creates suffering, but the lack of control over how one responds to them. The boundary is drawn not in denying emotions, but in learning when to allow them expression and when to hold them in stillness. To live without boundaries in emotional life is to be pulled endlessly by circumstances. Someone says a harsh word, and anger rises. The environment shifts and mood shifts with it. Praise arrives and one is lifted high. Criticism arrives and one is dragged low. This creates a life of dependency, a life reactive rather than proactive. The human being becomes like a leaf tossed by the wind, unable to find ground, unable to direct its course. But when the boundary is discovered, when one sees clearly that emotions are not rulers but servants, the quality of existence changes. Suddenly, a new strength is felt because one has chosen not to give full authority to every passing wave of feeling. Control does not mean suppression. Suppression is an act of violence against oneself, a pushing down of what naturally arises. Suppression builds pressure, and eventually pressure demands release. Control in the true sense is understanding. It is to observe the flame of anger without throwing it onto another, to sit with sadness without drowning in it, to feel excitement without losing balance. This boundary is subtle because it requires vigilance. It requires a watchfulness that is not asleep, that does not give in to automatic reactions. It is in this watchfulness that discipline grows, and through discipline, the power of mastery begins to shine. The ancient teachings often describe emotions as wild horses. If the rider has no reins, the horses run in every direction, dragging the rider through the mud, the forest, and the cliffs. If the rider pulls too tightly, the horses suffer, they resist, they weaken. But if the rider knows how to balance firmness with gentleness, then the horses become allies, guiding the rider across great distances with strength and beauty. This image is the essence of emotional control. The horses are necessary, they carry life's energy, but without a boundary they consume. With wisdom they serve. Observe carefully. When anger takes hold without boundary, words are spoken that cannot be taken back. Actions are made that leave scars. Decisions are taken that bring regret. When fear is allowed to rule without control, opportunities are lost, potential is hidden, and life becomes smaller than it is meant to be. When desire overwhelms without limit, one chases endlessly, never satisfied, never still. The lack of boundary is not freedom, it is slavery to passing states. Yet when the line is drawn, when one knows, here I feel, but here I choose, then emotions no longer carry the power to control destiny. Instead, they become part of the inner orchestra, instruments that can be played with harmony rather than chaos. To reach such a state, one must cultivate awareness of the body and the mind. The body speaks first, the tightening of the jaw, the quickening of the breath, the racing of the heart. These are signals, not enemies. They are invitations to pause, to breathe deeply, to remember that between stimulus and response lies a space, and within that space is the boundary of control. In that space, choice lives. Without awareness, the space disappears and reaction dominates. With awareness, time slows, and in that slowing comes power. Many misunderstand control as the absence of emotion, as though strength means never to feel. But the wise know that sensitivity is not weakness. To feel deeply is to be alive. Control is not the erasure of emotion, but the shaping of it, the directing of it toward purpose rather than chaos. Joy, when controlled, becomes gratitude rather than indulgence. Anger, when controlled, becomes clarity and determination rather than destruction. Fear, when controlled, becomes caution and wisdom rather than paralysis. The boundary of emotional control transforms raw impulses into cultivated strengths. Life itself will always test these boundaries. No one is exempt from provocation, from pain, from sudden surges of feeling. The difference lies in whether these storms dictate the course of one's journey or whether one stands firm within the storm, using its winds for movement rather than collapse. The one who has no boundary shouts, strikes, retreats, regrets. The one who has cultivated boundary breathes, waits, considers, acts with precision. Both feel, but one is enslaved while the other is free. It is worth reflecting that even the most disciplined monk or the most seasoned warrior is not without emotion. What separates them from the ordinary is not what they feel, but what they do with what they feel. Their discipline does not kill passion, it channels it. Their control does not create coldness, it creates balance. To live without this balance is to be endlessly reactive, but to live with it is to become steady, unmoved by every passing wind, and yet deeply alive within. The boundary of emotional control is not a rigid wall, it is a flexible strength. It bends without breaking, it absorbs without collapsing, it shapes without destroying. Such a boundary is not built overnight. It is trained daily in small moments, in the ordinary irritations, in the quiet disappointments, in the fleeting joys. Each time awareness is brought to an emotion before it takes command, the boundary strengthens. Each time one chooses not to be mastered by a passing storm, the inner foundation grows. The world will not stop testing these boundaries. Situations will continue to arise. People will continue to act in ways that stir the inner waters. But as the practice deepens, what once caused turbulence becomes a ripple, what once consumed the mind becomes a passing shadow, and what once seemed uncontrollable becomes part of the dance of life. Presence is a state of being that transcends physical appearances and material conditions. It is the quiet strength that arises when the mind no longer clings to what is external. When one learns to cultivate presence without dependence, a profound shift occurs. The heart becomes lighter, the mind becomes clear, and the energy within no longer scatters in pursuit of validation, approval, or control. Dependence creates chains, subtle and invisible, but heavy. Presence without dependence is liberation, an unshakable awareness that does not require constant reinforcement from the outside world. Dependence manifests in many forms. It can be the need for someone's attention to feel worthy. It can be the craving for material possessions to feel secure. It can be the attachment to routines, roles, or titles to feel valuable. Each of these ties the mind to external anchors. The danger is not in having relationships, possessions, or roles. It is in allowing them to define who you are. When the core of your presence is rooted in dependence, the loss or change of those external factors brings instability. But when the core of your presence is cultivated from within, you remain whole regardless of circumstances. True presence does not fluctuate with the environment. Imagine the mountain that stands through seasons. Snow falls, winds blow, rains wash, and sunlight returns, but the mountain remains unmoved. In the same way, presence is the inner mountain that does not rise and fall with praise or blame, gain or loss. When a person depends on external affirmation to feel steady, they are like a leaf carried by the wind. When they discover presence without dependence, they are like the mountain, grounded, immovable, radiating strength without demanding recognition. The cultivation of this presence begins with awareness. To recognize dependence is the first step. Often dependence hides itself in subtle forms: the urge to check for messages repeatedly, the restlessness that arises when attention is not given, the feeling of unease when one is not in control. These small patterns reveal the hidden strings that pull the mind. Observing them without judgment allows one to see where the roots of attachment lie. Awareness weakens dependence because it brings light to what was unconscious. Once the pattern is seen clearly, its power begins to fade. Presence without dependence arises when the mind learns to rest in itself. This is not isolation. It is not the rejection of connection or the denial of relationships. Instead, it is the realization that the source of strength, peace, and clarity is not external but internal. When the mind settles into its own silence, it discovers a well of stability. From this stability, one can engage fully with others without grasping at them. Relationships then become expressions of fullness, not transactions of need. To sit with someone in presence without dependence is to give them the gift of authenticity. Nothing is forced, nothing is demanded, and yet the bond feels deeper because it is free. Dependence often arises from fear. The fear of being alone, the fear of being unseen, the fear of not being enough. These fears create a restless search outside, hoping that something or someone can fill the gap. But what dependence does not realize is that the gap is an illusion. Wholeness already exists within, but it is obscured by the noise of grasping. When dependence fades, fear fades with it, and in its place grows the quiet assurance of inner sufficiency. The person no longer begs the world for completion. They radiate completion into the world. Presence without dependence transforms action. A person who acts from dependence seeks reward, recognition, or validation. Their energy is entangled with the outcome. But a person who acts from presence moves with clarity and precision, not for approval, but because it is aligned with truth. Their energy is not consumed by fear of failure or hunger for success. This kind of action has power because it is free of distortion. Just as clear water reflects the sky without disturbance, presence without dependence reflects reality without clinging. There is also a spiritual dimension to presence without dependence. When one stops clinging to what is external, the mind turns naturally inward. In this inwardness, silence grows. In silence, the connection to life itself becomes vivid. One does not feel isolated, but rather deeply united with everything. This paradox is striking. By letting go of dependence, one does not lose connection, but discovers a deeper form of connection. Dependence creates grasping, and grasping narrows awareness. Freedom from dependence expands awareness, allowing one to feel life not as something to capture, but as something to flow with. Consider the flame of a candle. If the flame leans too heavily on the air, it flickers and dies. But if it burns with its own steady presence, it illuminates the space around it without effort. Presence without dependence is like that flame. It does not strain, it does not cling, and yet it radiates light. This light draws others naturally, but it does not seek them. It is whole in itself. To live in presence without dependence is to carry freedom into every interaction. It is to walk into the world with openness, but without neediness. It is to offer love without demanding it in return. It is to work with dedication, but without clinging to the fruit. It is to enjoy what is given without fearing its loss. This way of being creates peace, for nothing external can disturb the inner foundation. It also creates strength, for energy is no longer drained by constant craving. It creates authenticity, for every word and action comes from truth, not from the hunger to be seen. Strength is often mistaken for noise, for loudness, for an external display of force and dominance. Yet when one observes the natural world and the wisdom carried within it, the truth becomes clearer. The strongest elements rarely announce themselves. Mountains do not shout, yet they stand unmoved for thousands of years. The ocean does not need to declare its power, yet its tides shape the very contours of the land. The sky does not raise its voice, but its presence contains all life within its vastness. Silent strength is the kind of power that does not depend on attention, recognition, or validation. It exists as it is, firm, grounded, and unshaken. When you encounter a person of silent strength, you feel it before they speak. Their presence alone carries a weight that is not heavy but steady. They do not need to convince you of their worth, nor do they demand acknowledgement. Their strength does not flare in bursts of anger or in displays of arrogance. It radiates through calmness, through measured words, and through the ability to remain balanced in situations where others would crumble. Silent strength does not need applause, because it is not born for performance. It is cultivated inwardly through patience, through discipline, and through the ability to listen deeply to oneself and to the world. In a world where noise is constant, where everyone wants to be heard louder than the next, silent strength becomes rare. Yet, it is precisely in its rarity that its value is found. Noise can distract, but silence penetrates. A few moments of silence can reveal truths that hours of talking could not uncover. Silence allows the mind to settle, the heart to breathe, and clarity to arise. To embody silent strength is to live in a state where noise no longer dictates your actions. It means you are not rushed by the pace of others, not shaken by their chaos, and not defined by their approval or rejection. Silent strength is not weakness disguised, nor is it the absence of power. It is the refinement of power. Consider a river. At times, it flows quietly, gently, nourishing everything in its path. But even when it moves silently, its current holds immense force. The strength of the river is not diminished by its silence. In fact, its silence often conceals its depth. Similarly, those who embody silent strength do not need to announce their potential, for it is already there, undeniable, felt even without words. Cultivating silent strength requires the willingness to withdraw from constant reaction. It requires the patience to listen instead of immediately responding, to observe instead of rushing to judge, and to hold space instead of filling it with unnecessary action. In silence, you learn to separate what is essential from what is not. You begin to notice how often people exhaust themselves with noise, arguing, justifying, proving. Silent strength does not seek to prove. It simply is. When challenges arrive, silent strength reveals itself most clearly. While noise panics, silence breathes. While noise resists, silence accepts and adapts. The one who has cultivated silent strength does not collapse under the weight of difficulty. Instead, they endure because endurance is born from stillness, not from chaos. When storms pass, those with silent strength are still standing, not because they fought louder, but because they rooted themselves deeper. Silent strength is also the strength of restraint. In a heated moment, it is easy to react, to let anger dictate action, to allow words to fly like arrows. But strength is not in the ease of reaction. It is in the discipline of restraint. To stay calm when provoked, to choose silence when noise demands attention, to respond with clarity instead of impulse, that is strength. The ability to hold your ground without aggression, to carry your values without needing to impose them, to continue walking your path regardless of the distractions, that is silent strength. It is important to understand that silence here does not mean passivity. Silent strength is active, though its activity is subtle. It is the act of holding peace within when external forces attempt to disrupt it. It is the act of maintaining clarity in the middle of confusion. It is the act of choosing presence over reaction. Such strength does not diminish action but refines it. When you act from silent strength, your actions are deliberate, precise, and effective. Silent strength also creates space for others. It does not overpower, it does not overshadow. Instead, it allows others to discover their own strength. Just as a strong tree offers shade without demanding gratitude, silent strength supports without needing recognition. Its power is not in dominance but in steadiness. Those around such strength feel safe because they know it will not waver. To embody silent strength is to step away from the illusion that power must be loud. It is to understand that what is quiet can often be the most enduring. Words may echo for a time, but silence echoes eternally. Noise may draw attention for a moment, but silence holds presence without end. Silent strength cannot be easily disturbed because it is not rooted in the external. It is rooted deep within, in the places where no one else can reach. When one cultivates silent strength, life begins to shift, reactions lessen, clarity grows, and presence deepens. The world will continue to move with its noise, but within there will be stillness. That stillness becomes an anchor unshaken by storms, unbroken by challenges, and untouched by distractions. Silent strength does not seek to overpower life, it seeks to flow with it, to endure with it, and to remain unshaken by it. There exists within every human being a silent measurement, an invisible framework that determines how we perceive ourselves, how we interact with the world, and how we respond to challenges. This is not the external set of rules imposed by society, nor the comparisons we make when looking at the lives of others. This is something deeper, something more personal. It is the inner standard. The inner standard is the quiet compass that guides behavior when no one is watching, the unseen line that one either rises above or falls beneath. It is the level of discipline, clarity, and integrity that one chooses to uphold regardless of circumstances. Most people live in response to outer standards. They want recognition, validation, applause. They measure themselves by the progress of others, constantly asking, am I ahead or am I behind? But the deeper way, the transformative way, does not rely on such fleeting measurements. External standards are unstable. They shift with time, trends, and the judgment of others. The inner standard, however, is rooted in something much more enduring. It is forged in solitude, strengthened by reflection, and tested through the challenges of daily living. When one begins to cultivate an inner standard, the need for external approval diminishes. Actions are no longer dictated by fear of rejection or desire for praise. Instead, they are born from a quiet conviction: this is the way I choose to live, whether anyone notices or not. The one who has refined their inner standard walks into a room without the need to dominate, impress, or compete. Their presence carries weight, not because of external decoration, but because of internal alignment. The cultivation of this inner standard is not easy. It requires honesty, and honesty is often uncomfortable. To look at oneself without excuse or disguise demands courage. To admit where one has been lazy, careless, or inconsistent is not pleasant. Yet it is in this discomfort that strength is built. The inner standard asks, who are you when the world is silent? What choices do you make when no one will know? How do you treat others when there is nothing to gain? Discipline is at the core of the inner standard. Discipline not as punishment but as alignment. Just as a craftsman sharpens his tools before working, a human must sharpen his habits, thoughts, and actions. Without discipline, the inner standard remains an idea, never embodied in action. Waking up on time, practicing daily, holding promises, speaking truth. These are not small acts, they are the training ground of integrity. Over time, these small acts accumulate and the person begins to radiate an unshakable steadiness. Another aspect of the inner standard is clarity. A blurred mind cannot uphold strong standards. Clarity arises from stillness, from the willingness to silence distractions and listen to what is essential. With clarity, one is not pulled endlessly by desires or fears. With clarity, decisions become precise and actions gain direction. The inner standard thrives on clarity because it requires the ability to distinguish between what is temporary and what is lasting, between what is noise and what is truth. Integrity is the third pillar. Without integrity, the inner standard collapses into pretense. Integrity means the alignment of word, thought, and deed. It means being the same person in private as in public. It means that one's promises to others are honored because one has learned to honor promises made to oneself. A person with integrity does not need to broadcast their values. Those values are visible in every step, every choice, every gesture. The strength of the inner standard is that it does not depend on favorable conditions. When storms arrive, when pressure builds, when life becomes uncertain, the external standards often dissolve. The praise of others fades, the admiration of the crowd disappears, and suddenly one stands alone. In such moments, it is only the inner standard that remains as anchor. It whispers, hold to discipline, remain clear, stay true. Those who have cultivated this inner foundation are not easily shaken, for they have learned to stand on ground that does not crumble. It is also important to understand that the inner standard is not rigid perfectionism. It does not demand flawlessness or punish mistakes. Instead, it provides a living framework for growth. It acknowledges failure as part of the process, yet it refuses to allow repeated excuses. The inner standard accepts imperfection but does not allow complacency. It is a balance of compassion and firmness, of understanding and discipline. The beauty of the inner standard is that it cannot be faked. One may wear masks for the world, but inside one always knows the truth. That truth is inescapable. One can pretend to be disciplined, but the body remembers. One can pretend to be wise, but the mind knows its own chaos. One can pretend to be aligned, but the heart feels the dissonance. The inner standard strips away all illusions and places the individual face to face with themselves. To raise the inner standard is to raise the quality of life itself. When discipline deepens, life becomes ordered. When clarity grows, confusion dissolves. When integrity strengthens, relationships become authentic. Each time one elevates their inner standard, the outer world slowly adjusts to match it. The opportunities one attracts, the people who enter one's life, the respect one earns, all these become reflections of the level of inner commitment maintained. This path is not for everyone. Many prefer the comfort of living by external measurements because it allows blame to be shifted outward. But the one who chooses the inner path accepts responsibility. They stop waiting for others to define them and instead define themselves. They understand that freedom is not found in lowering the bar to make life easy, but in raising the bar to make life meaningful. The inner standard is not static. It evolves as the individual evolves. What was once difficult becomes natural, and then new challenges arise. To live by an inner standard is to live in continuous refinement. It is not about reaching a final point, but about never ceasing to polish the mirror of the self. In this lifelong polishing, one discovers that true strength, dignity, and peace do not come from competing with the world, but from measuring oneself against the quiet voice within